The moment Clyde Ellsworth rode into the dusty outpost town of Redrock Crossing, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, three different men warned him about Ada Merriweather before he had even tied his horse to a post. The first was old Hector Briggs, who ran the livery stable at the edge of town and had the weather-beaten look of a man who had seen far too many things he wished he could forget. Hector squinted up at Clyde from beneath the brim of a crumpled hat and said, without any preamble whatsoever, "You see that bay mare tied up outside the saloon? You stay away from the woman who rides her. She is nothing but trouble, friend. Trouble from the first mile you travel with her." The second warning came from a sunburned ranch hand named Percy who was watering his horses at the trough outside the livery, and who jumped into the conversation the way a man does when he has been waiting for the exact right opportunity. "He is right," Percy said, pointing a finger for emphasis. "Ada Merriweather is a woman who has left 3 different towns in a cloud of dust and bad feeling. She argues with sheriffs. She argues with judges. She does not know how to keep her head down." The third man did not give his name. He was leaning against the wall of the general store with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he simply said, "Trouble," as Clyde walked past, jerking his chin in the direction of the saloon. Clyde stopped walking. He turned and looked at the bay mare tied outside the saloon, a fine-boned animal with an alert eye and good strong legs, and then he looked at all 3 men in turn. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair, and set the hat back on his head with a deliberate motion that suggested he had thought about what he was going to say before he said it. "That is fine," Clyde said plainly, "because I have ridden trouble before." Then he walked into the saloon. The place smelled like sawdust and spilled whiskey, and the particular kind of desperation that settles into rooms where men spend too much money on cards and drink. It was mid-afternoon, so the crowd was thin. A bartender polished glasses behind a long counter. 2 men played cards at a corner table. A woman sat alone at a table near the window with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, a ledger book spread open, and a pen moving across the page with quick, purposeful strokes. She looked up when Clyde walked in, and he got his first good look at Ada Merriweather. She was somewhere around 26 or 27 years old, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up but not quite successfully, since several strands had escaped and curled softly against her jaw and the back of her neck. Her eyes were a startling shade of amber brown, the color of creek water over sandstone, and they assessed him with the kind of direct, measuring intelligence that some men found deeply unsettling. She wore a practical riding dress in deep blue, dusty at the hem from recent travel, and there was a thin scar along her left jawline, small and silvery, that she wore without any apparent concern. She was not soft-looking in any conventional sense. She was vivid. She was present in a way that filled the room. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, determined he was not an immediate threat, and returned her gaze to her ledger. Clyde walked to the bar and ordered coffee. The bartender poured it and leaned on the counter. "You just ride in." "This morning," Clyde said. "Where from?" "Colorado mostly. I have been moving south, looking for land." The bartender nodded. "Plenty of land in New Mexico Territory. Question is whether the land wants you." Clyde wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of lean, working build that came from a lifetime on horseback. He had a straight nose, a jaw that needed shaving, and a pair of gray eyes that tended to make people feel as though he was reading something written on the inside of their thoughts. He was not the biggest man in any room he walked into, but there was a quietness about him, a deliberateness, that made people instinctively lower their voices when he was nearby. "I have been wanting to set up a small ranch," Clyde said. "I have got some money saved and a good eye for horses. I heard there is land available around the Redrock Basin." "There is," the bartender agreed. "Plenty of it. Bert Calloway has been buying up a fair piece of it, though. He is not always friendly about competition." Clyde glanced at the woman by the window. She had stopped writing and was looking at the far wall with an expression on her face that suggested she had heard something that interested her deeply. "Who is Calloway?" Clyde asked. From the table by the window, without looking up from the wall she was staring at, Ada Merriweather said clearly, "He is a land-grabbing bully with 3 hired guns and a county surveyor on his payroll, and the sheriff is afraid of him. That is who he is." There was a silence in the saloon. The 2 card players glanced over and then quickly returned to their cards in the way of men who had learned that looking too long at Ada Merriweather's opinions tended to drag a person into them. Clyde turned on his barstool and looked at her properly. "You sound like you have met him." She finally looked up from the wall and met his gaze. "I have been trying to prove that he manipulated the survey lines on 3 homestead parcels to push out the families living on them. 2 of those families are now sleeping in their wagons on the edge of town." She paused. "He had me escorted out of the land office last week by 2 men with their hands on their guns." "That would explain some things," Clyde said. "What things?" "3 men warned me away from you before I even reached the door." Something shifted in her expression. It was not quite a smile. It was something more complicated than that, a flicker of tired amusement wrapped around something older and harder. "Were they polite about it at least?" "They used the word trouble, repeatedly. People use that word a great deal when a woman refuses to accept being lied to." She looked back at her ledger and drew a neat line beneath a column of figures. "I hope you take their advice." "I already told them I have ridden trouble before," Clyde said. She looked up again. This time the assessment in her eyes was different, slower, more careful. "That is either very brave or very foolish," she said. "My mother always said those 2 things were closer together than people like to admit." She picked up her coffee, discovered it was cold, set it back down, and turned in her chair to face him more squarely. "I am Ada Merriweather. I am a cartographer and a land surveyor, and I have been hired by the Vasquez family and the Tanner family to prove that their homestead claims were legally valid before Calloway's men ran them off." Clyde Ellsworth. He picked up his coffee cup and walked to her table. "May I?" She considered him for a moment. Then she gestured at the chair across from her. "Sit down, Mr. Ellsworth, and if you are planning to buy land in the Redrock Basin, you should probably know exactly what you are walking into." He sat down, and that was how it started. Ada Merriweather's story was not a simple one, and she did not make it simple in the telling. She had grown up in Santa Fe, the daughter of a surveyor father who had taught her to read topographical maps before she was 10 years old, and had taken her on survey expeditions through some of the most inhospitable terrain in the territory. When her father died of fever when she was 19, she had taken over his work because there was no one else to do it, and because she was, as she said plainly, better at it than most of the men who might have claimed the work instead. She had spent the better part of 7 years fighting for the legal right to do work that she did as well as or better than anyone in the territory, and she had developed in those years a very clear, very clean contempt for men who believed that authority and the truth were the same thing. Bert Calloway, she explained, had been acquiring land in the Redrock Basin for the past 3 years through a combination of legal purchase, questionable loan arrangements, and at least 2 instances of survey manipulation that she was certain of, and could prove if she had access to the original land office documents. The problem was that the deputy land commissioner, a man named Silas Graft, was either on Calloway's payroll or deeply in his debt, which amounted to the same thing. "The original survey markers for the Vasquez parcel were moved," she said, spreading the ledger open on the table between them so he could see her notations. "I measured it myself. The eastern boundary is 14 feet west of where the original government survey placed it, which pushed the Vasquez claim over the creek line and onto what Calloway claims as his range. Without the creek water, the homestead is not viable, and that is what Calloway knew." Clyde studied the notations. He was not a surveyor, but he had spent enough time buying and selling land and horses in Colorado to be able to read measurements and recognize when numbers had been arranged with a specific purpose in mind. "Can you prove the markers were moved and not originally placed there?" I have two witnesses who were present at the original survey in 1874 who will testify to the original positions. What I do not have is access to the government survey ledger from that year, because Graft has declined to produce it. He says it is being audited. Her voice carried an edge that was not quite bitterness, more like the particular frustration of someone who keeps finding the door locked no matter how many keys they try. The audit has apparently been ongoing for 4 months. That is a long audit. It is a convenient audit. Clyde leaned back in his chair and looked at her. She was watching him with that careful, measuring look, and he recognized it for what it was. She had been disappointed by people who claimed to want to help before, and she was not in the business of trusting anyone she had not yet earned a reason to trust. "I am going to need to file land claims myself," he said slowly. "I would need to work with the land office. And graft. And graft." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "I am a reasonably plain-looking, apparently harmless stranger from Colorado who nobody in this town has a reason to watch carefully yet. If someone were to go through the land office files, they would not be looking for me." Ada went very still. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Ellsworth?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Clyde said, and the hint of something that might have been a slow smile moved across his face. "I'm just thinking out loud about the kinds of things that might happen while a man is filing legitimate paperwork at the land office." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and made a small, careful notation in her ledger. "The land office closes at 5 o'clock. Graff takes his supper at Dolar's Eating House at 6 every evening, regular as a clock, and he is always gone for at least an hour. The deputy he leaves in charge is a young man named Willis who is 19 years old, very eager to please, and absolutely terrified of doing anything wrong. A man like that might be very willing to help a legitimate land buyer find the right forms," Clyde said. "He might be. And while he was distracted by that, someone who knew exactly what she was looking for might find it very quickly." Ada looked at him steadily. "That someone would be taking a considerable risk." "That someone has clearly been taking considerable risks for some time," Clyde said, meeting her eyes. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are thinking the same thought at the same moment and both of them know it. "You do not know me," she said. "No. You have no particular reason to help me." "I have a general reason," he said. "I have a strong personal objection to people moving boundary markers." She almost smiled. It was brief, like a flash of light through a closing door, but it was real. 4 o'clock tomorrow," she said. "I will meet you outside the land office." When she left the saloon a few minutes later, the bartender leaned over the counter and looked at Clyde with an expression that combined pity and disbelief in roughly equal measure. "You are actually going to help her, aren't you?" "I am going to file some land paperwork," Clyde said innocently. The bartender shook his head. "God help you, son." Clyde slept that night at the Redrock boarding house, in a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the darkened street, and he lay awake for a while thinking about amber-brown eyes and survey measurements, and the particular quality of Ada Merriweather's voice when she said the word convenient, the way it carried the exact weight of everything she had seen done under the cover of procedural compliance. He thought about Colorado, too. About the homestead he had tried to build there with his brother Amos, before Amos died of a lung illness 2 winters back. About the way land felt personal when you had worked it, about what it meant to have that taken. He thought about the Vasquez family sleeping in their wagon at the edge of town, and about how the distance between right and legal could sometimes be the width of 14 feet and a moved survey marker. He was up at dawn, checked on his horse at the livery, ate a breakfast of salt pork and corn bread at the boarding house, and spent the morning riding slowly through the basin to the south of town, looking at the land. He had good eyes for it. He could see where the grass was deep and where the soil was thin, where water ran and where it went dry in summer, where a man could build something that would last. The Redrock Basin was beautiful in a stark, clear-aired way. the red rock formations rising from the high desert floor like the bones of something enormous, the sky above them an impossible blue. He could see why people wanted it. He could see why a man like Calloway, who thought in terms of acres and water rights rather than beauty, would want it most of all. He passed, at one point, a camp at the edge of a dry wash where 2 wagons were pulled up, and a family of 6 was living out of them in the dusty, careful way of people who were accustomed to managing what little they had with great precision. A woman was washing clothes in a tin basin. 2 small children played in the dirt nearby. An older man sat on the wagon tongue with his hands hanging between his knees, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has been recently defeated and has not yet decided what to do about it. Clyde stopped his horse and tipped his hat. "Morning. Are you the Vasquez family?" The man looked up. He was perhaps 50, with a deeply lined face and dark, watchful eyes. "I am Miguel Vasquez. Who are you?" "My name is Clyde Ellsworth. I met Ada Merriweather yesterday. I understand she is working to restore your claim." Something complicated moved across Miguel Vasquez's face. "Ada Merriweather is a good woman who has worked very hard for us," he said carefully. "I'm not sure her work will be enough. Calloway has men everywhere." "I understand that." Clyde looked at the 2 small children playing in the dust, then back at Miguel. "I am going to try to help." Miguel studied him for a long moment with the measured wariness of a man who had learned that strangers offering help were not always what they appeared. Then slowly, he nodded once. "Be careful, Mr. Ellsworth." "I intend to be." At 3:30, Clyde hitched his horse outside the general store 2 doors down from the land office and waited. Ada appeared from around the corner at 4:03, walking quickly with her ledger tucked under her arm and a leather document case hanging from her shoulder. She had changed into a clean riding dress of dark brown, and her hair was pinned more firmly than it had been yesterday, though one curl had already escaped at her left temple. She was wearing leather gloves and her boots were freshly dusted. "You look like you are going to war," he said. "I'm going to look at documents, Mr. Ellsworth. It amounts to the same thing." She glanced at him. "Are you ready?" "Ready." They walked into the land office together. It was a small, dim room with shelves of ledgers and wooden filing cabinets arranged along the walls. A young man with sandy hair and a worried expression looked up from behind the desk. This was clearly Willis. "Good afternoon," Clyde said pleasantly. "I am new to the territory, and I am looking to file a provisional land claim in the Redrock Basin. Someone told me this was the place to start." Willis visibly relaxed at the word provisional. "Yes, sir, absolutely. I can help you with the initial filing forms. That would be the Homestead Act application and the provisional plat survey request." "Wonderful." Clyde settled himself at the counter with every appearance of a man who intended to take a very long time with his paperwork. "I have a number of questions about the specific parcels available in the basin. Can you walk me through what is currently designated as open federal land versus what has already been claimed?" Willis, who was 19 and eager and had clearly been waiting for someone to ask him a question he knew the full answer to, turned to the large cabinet behind him and began pulling maps and ledger indexes. While Willis's back was turned, Ada moved silently to the secondary filing cabinet along the far wall, the one labeled Survey Records 1870-1876. She opened it with quiet efficiency, moving through the files with the practiced speed of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and exactly where it would be. Clyde asked Willis 8 questions in a row, each one carefully designed to require a thorough answer and a physical search through the cabinet. He asked about water right designations along the creek basin. He asked about the Federal Survey grid reference numbers. He asked about the difference between provisional and perfected claims and what documentation was required for each stage. Willis answered everything with conscientious detail, and while he did, Ada worked through the 1874 survey files with quiet, focused speed. It took her 11 minutes. When she stepped back from the cabinet and gave Clyde the smallest possible nod, He wrapped up his conversation with Willis, accepted a sheaf of forms that he absolutely did not need, and thanked the young man warmly for his time. Outside, they walked around the corner, and then Ada stopped and opened her document case with hands that were not quite steady. She pulled out a folded document and opened it in the slanted afternoon light. "This is it," she said, and her voice had a quality he had not heard from her before, something raw and relieved underneath the controlled surface. "This is the original 1874 government survey record for the Vasquez parcel. The original boundary markers are documented clearly. The eastern boundary runs 14 feet east of where Callaway's markers currently sit." She traced a line on the document with one gloved finger. "This proves the markers were moved. This proves the Vasquez claim is valid." Clyde looked at the document over her shoulder. He was close enough to smell the faint, warm scent of her hair, something like cedar and clean wool. He did not step back. "Can you get a territorial judge to hear this? I know a judge in Santa Fe, Judge Harlan Price. He is honest, which is why he is in Santa Fe and not anywhere in this particular county." She carefully folded the document and placed it back in the leather case. "I need to get a copy of this made and the original sent to him. Callaway will know I have it within a day or two, because Graft will notice the file is missing when he returns tomorrow. Then you do not have much time." "No." She fastened the clasps of the document case and looked up at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite the carefully maintained practical surface she had shown him until now. It was something more direct. "Thank you," she said. "You did not have to do that. I know, most people would not have. I know that too." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Why did you?" He was quiet for a beat, thinking about his honest answer. "Because you are right, and you are trying to do the right thing, and someone ought to stand beside that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I do not have a great deal of experience with people who think that way." "That is a sorry state of affairs," he said. Something shifted in her face, something warmer and less guarded, and then she pulled it back to practicality because practicality was what the situation required. "I need to find someone to copy this tonight. The school teacher, Emmeline Cross, has good handwriting and she can be trusted. Then I need to get the original on the morning stage to Santa Fe." "I can put it on the stage," Clyde said. "I need to ride to the eastern edge of the basin tomorrow morning to look at the parcels out there. I can come back through town in time for the 9 o'clock stage." She handed him the document case. He took it. Their fingers did not touch, but they came close. "Do not lose that," she said. "I will guard it with my considerable personal stubbornness," he said. She looked at him for one more moment with those amber-brown eyes, and then she turned and walked away toward the schoolhouse at the end of the street. And Clyde stood there in the late afternoon light of Redrock Crossing with a leather document case in his hands, and the strong, clear feeling that he had just made a decision that was going to change the direction of his life. Over the next 3 days, something shifted between them in the way that things shift between people who are working closely toward a shared purpose and are too busy and too focused to notice what is happening to them until it is already well underway. They met each morning at Ada's table in the saloon. She brought her survey notes and maps, and he brought his observations from his daily rides through the basin, and together they built a picture of exactly what Callaway had done and where and when. Clyde turned out to have a sharp eye for the kind of physical detail that survey work required, noticing things like inconsistencies in fence line ages and the subtle differences between original handset boundary stones and newer ones that had been placed in the ground more recently. Ada found herself looking forward to his observations in a way that surprised her. He was precise, and he was honest, and he did not talk over her or around her or tell her what she already knew. He listened to her expertise and applied it to what he saw, and he asked questions that were worth asking. He was also, she was slowly and somewhat reluctantly beginning to notice, an extraordinarily good-looking man. Not in a flashy or theatrical way, but in the settled, unassuming way of someone who simply lived in their own body with total ease. The gray eyes that saw things clearly. The careful, deliberate way he moved, suggesting a lifetime of working around large animals and rugged country that required you to be exactly where you meant to be and no other place. The way he held himself when he was listening, with a quality of complete attention that made a person feel genuinely heard. She found him noticing her in return in the same quiet, serious way, and she found that instead of making her uncomfortable, it made her feel something that she had mostly stopped allowing herself to feel. Seen. Specifically and accurately seen. On the fourth evening, Calloway's men made their first move. Ada was returning to the boarding house at dusk when two riders came alongside her from the alley between the blacksmith shop and the feed store. They did not touch her. They were too careful for that. But they positioned their horses close enough that she had to stop walking, and the taller one, a thin man with a flat, cold expression named Hobart, leaned down from his saddle and told her that it would be in her best interests to take the next stage out of Redrock Crossing and not return. "Mr. Calloway is a patient man," Hobart said, "but he has limits." "I am sure he does," Ada said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was doing something considerably less steady inside her chest, but she had been in enough difficult situations to know that showing fear to men like Hobart accomplished nothing useful. "Tell Mr. Calloway that I will leave when I have finished my work here and not before." Hobart looked at her for a long moment with a flat expression that contained an unmistakable threat. Then both men turned their horses and rode back down the alley. Ada walked the remaining distance to the boarding house at a careful, even pace and went directly to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed for approximately 3 minutes doing the private, quiet version of being frightened that she allowed herself. And then she opened her survey notes and went back to work. The following morning she told Clyde what had happened with the straightforward matter-of-factness of someone reporting field conditions. The change in his face was immediate and not small. It was not an explosion of anger. It was something colder and more focused, the particular quality of a man who has just been given important information and is integrating it into his assessment of the situation. "That will not happen again," he said. "I do not need protection," she said. "I need the survey documents delivered to Santa Fe." "I sent the original 4 days ago," he said. "I also sent a letter to Judge Price explaining the situation." She looked at him. "You wrote to Price?" "I know Price's clerk. We worked adjacent parcels in Colorado some years back. I thought it might be useful to have someone vouch for the credibility of the documents." He met her eyes. "I should have told you before. I acted without asking first. I apologize for that." She was quiet for a moment. People who apologized for overstepping without being asked to were not a common feature of her experience. "It was the right thing to do," she said. "But yes, tell me next time." "Agreed." There was a small silence. Outside, the main street of Redrock Crossing was already busy with the morning's commerce, wagons and horses, and the voices of the town's business being conducted at normal volume. "I am also going to start riding with you," Clyde said. "Not to interfere with your work, just to be present." "People will talk," she said. "People are already talking," he said. "They have been talking since the minute I sat down at your table." "That is true." She looked at her survey notes and then back at him. There was something in the straightforwardness of his statement that she found, against her better judgment, deeply comforting. "All right." He rode with her that morning out to the southwest corner of the basin, where she needed to take additional measurements for the Tanner family's claim, which was a separate parcel with its own set of boundary irregularities. He held the measuring chain when she needed it held, drove the stakes when she needed them driven, and otherwise stayed out of her way and let her work, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which she appreciated with a specific and particular gratitude. They stopped at noon at the base of a red rock formation beside a small spring to eat. Ada had brought bread and dried meat wrapped in cloth. Clyde produced an orange from his saddlebag with the slightly theatrical pleasure of a man who knew it was an unexpected luxury, and Ada laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm, when he held it out to her. "Where did you get an orange?" she demanded. "The general store had a shipment from California yesterday. I bought 3. He produced the other 2. I believe in the strategic deployment of citrus in difficult situations. She was still laughing, soft and genuine, as she took it from him. He found that her laugh did something to the quality of the air around them, brightened it somehow, and he recognized the sensation as the dangerous and wonderful one of beginning to fall for someone. They sat beside the spring and ate and talked in a different way than they had been talking, less about survey lines and boundary markers, and more about themselves. He told her about Colorado and about Amos, and about the years of working cattle ranches, and then a horse trading operation before he had saved enough to think about his own land. She told him about her father, and about the 7 years of fighting to be taken seriously in work she could do better than the men who dismissed her, and about the 2 towns before Redrock Crossing, where she had documented land fraud and been run out before she could finish the job. In Copperhead Creek, she said, the sheriff actually came to my room at the boarding house at midnight and told me I had until dawn to be out of town. He was apologetic about it, which somehow made it worse. Because it meant he knew it was wrong, Clyde said. Exactly. She was quiet for a moment, peeling the orange with careful fingers. I sometimes wonder if I am too stubborn for my own good. Most women in my situation would have found a quieter way to make a living. Most women in your situation did not have your father or your abilities or your sense of what is right, Clyde said. He was watching her with those gray eyes that seemed to see around corners. I do not think what you do is stubborn. I think it is necessary, and I think you know that, which is why you keep doing it regardless of midnight visits from apologetic sheriffs. She looked at him. The afternoon light was warm and golden against the red stone, and somewhere in the basin below them a hawk was circling on a thermal, unhurried and clean-lined. You are a very unusual man, Clyde Ellsworth, she said. I have been told that before, he said. Not always as a compliment. Today it is one. The warmth that moved through him at that was not small. They rode back to town in the long copper light of late afternoon, side by side at an easy walk, and when they reached the edge of town, Ada found herself not particularly wanting to turn toward the boarding house. She found herself wanting to keep riding in the warm evening air with this man who listened to her and saw her clearly, and did not tell her what she was and wasn't capable of. But there was work to do, and the tension in town was building, because everyone knew by now that Calloway knew what she had found, and the question was not whether he would act but when and how. The how became clearer 3 days later, when Judge Harlan Price sent word from Santa Fe that he had received the survey document and Clyde's letter, that he found the evidence compelling, and that he was prepared to issue a ruling, but that he needed a formal deposition from Ada and from the 2 witnesses to the original 1874 survey. He needed them in Santa Fe within 10 days. 10 days. Santa Fe was 4 days' hard ride to the south. Clyde brought the message to Ada that evening and set it on the table in front of her. She read it 3 times, then set it down and sat very still for a moment. I need to get there and get the depositions arranged, she said. We need to get there, Clyde said. I'm not sending you to Santa Fe by yourself with Calloway's men watching this town. She opened her mouth. I know, he said before she could speak. You do not need protection. You are fully capable of riding to Santa Fe alone. I am also aware of all of that. I am asking, as someone who has a significant personal interest in your continuing health and well-being, to be allowed to make the journey with you. The word personal hung in the air between them for a moment. Ada closed her mouth. Something moved through her eyes that was soft and complicated. Personal, she repeated. Yes, he said simply. She looked at him across the table, and there was nothing in her expression now of the careful, self-protective distance she had maintained in the beginning. There was something else entirely, something open and honest and just slightly undone around the edges. All right, she said quietly. We leave at dawn. They left at dawn. Miguel Vasquez, who they had informed of the plan, pressed Clyde's hand with both of his own and said, Bring her back safe, in the way of a man entrusting someone with something precious. They rode south through country that grew steadily more dramatic as the hours passed, the red rock formations giving way to long flat tablelands, and then to the broken country of arroyos and juniper forest that marked the transition toward Santa Fe. The second witness to the 1874 survey, a retired government surveyor named Allen Hatch, lived in a small town called Mesilla 3 days south of Redrock Crossing, and they stopped there to collect his deposition before pressing on. Allen Hatch was 80 years old, small and bird-like, with perfect recall and a deep personal outrage about what had been done to the Vasquez land. He gave his deposition to Ada with a precision and detail that made her work easy, and then he looked at Clyde with a sharp, appraising eye and said, "You two married?" "No," Ada said. "Why not?" Allen asked with the directness of a man who had decided in his 80s that there was no longer any reason to be indirect. "We have only known each other for 11 days, Ada said patiently. "My wife and I knew each other for 6, Allen said and returned to his tea. They rode on the next morning. The days were long and warm, and the evenings were cool and full of stars, the enormous southwestern sky turning black and brilliant overhead while they camped beside small fires. They talked for hours each night, moving easily between the practical and the personal in a way that felt natural and necessary, covering ground between them that they needed to cover. He told her about the specific grief of losing his brother, about how it had clarified something for him about what mattered. She told him about the loneliness of her years of solitary work, about how she had mostly made her peace with it, but had never quite entirely stopped missing the idea of having someone who would stay. "People leave," she said on the third night matter-of-factly looking at the fire, "or they tell you to leave. It amounts to the same thing." "I do not leave," he said. She looked at him across the fire. He was sitting with his knees drawn up and his forearms resting on them, looking at her steadily. The firelight caught the gray of his eyes and made them warm. He meant it. She could see that he meant it in the specific and uncomplicated way that some people simply state true things without drama. "You do not know me well enough to say that yet," she said. "I know you well enough," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at the fire. But she did not argue with him, and the silence that followed was the kind that deepens and settles and becomes something you carry with you. On the fourth morning, they rode into Santa Fe. Santa Fe in the spring of 1878 was a vivid, complicated place, an ancient city that had been Spanish and then Mexican, and was now American in a way that had not entirely resolved itself. Layers of culture and history visible in every adobe wall and plaza, and the mixture of languages in the streets. Ada had grown up here, and Clyde watched her settle back into it with an ease and confidence that was different from her manner in Redrock Crossing, where she had always been a little braced for the next obstacle. Here, she moved through the plazas and streets with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she was and was glad to be there. Judge Harlan Price received them in his chambers that afternoon. He was a square-built man of 60 with a close-cut gray beard and the quality of a person who had been presented with a great many attempts to manipulate him and had developed a clear and settled immunity to all of them. He read the survey document carefully, read Allen Hatch's written deposition, and asked Ada a series of precise questions about her methodology that she answered with calm, detailed expertise. At the end, he removed his reading spectacles and set them on the desk. "Miss Merriweather, this evidence is substantial. In my assessment, the original Vasquez homestead claim is legally valid, and the boundary markers were moved without authorization subsequent to the original government survey. I will issue a ruling accordingly and send marshals to Redrock Crossing to oversee the restoration of the correct boundaries." Ada was very still. "And the Tanner claim, I will need the additional survey documentation you mentioned for that parcel. If the measurements support your preliminary findings, I will include it in the same ruling." "They will support it," she said. "I will have the full documentation ready for you within a week of our return." Price nodded. He looked at Clyde. "And you are?" "A witness to events in Redrock Crossing," Clyde said. and a man with a personal interest in seeing justice done in the Redrock Basin. Price looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality of a man who had a very good eye for character. Then he nodded once. "I will have the preliminary order drawn up by tomorrow morning. You should carry a copy with you when you return. It will not stop Calloway's men from making trouble, but it will give the territorial marshal grounds to act if they do." "Thank you, Judge," Ada said, and the two words carried the weight of 7 years of hard work and closed doors and midnight warnings. They stayed in Santa Fe for 2 nights. The first evening, Ada took Clyde to a small restaurant near the plaza that she had loved as a girl, a place with whitewashed walls and red clay pots of flowers on every table, and a menu that ran to red chili stew and fresh tortillas, and a dessert made with piloncillo and cinnamon that Clyde declared was the best thing he had eaten in a decade. They ate slowly and talked and laughed more than they had laughed in the concentrated seriousness of the past 2 weeks, and somewhere between the stew and the dessert, without planning or announcement, Ada reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "I have been trying to be sensible about you," she said. "How is that going?" "Not very well," she admitted. "Good," he said. She looked at their joined hands on the table. "I'm still going to argue with sheriffs. I'm still going to document land fraud and make enemies of powerful men with hired guns. I'm not a quiet woman, and I am not a simple one." "Ada," he said, and the way he said her name, as though it were something he had been waiting to say plainly for a while, made her go still. "I rode south from Colorado specifically to find somewhere to build a life, and somewhere along a particular saloon table in Redrock Crossing I understood that the land I was looking for was secondary to the person I had found. I know who you are. I am not asking you to be anything other than exactly that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been alone for a very long time." "I know." He held her hand. "So have I." That was the night it shifted entirely, openly and without reservation. They walked back from the restaurant through the warm Santa Fe evening, through the lamplight falling across the plaza stones, and when they reached the gate of the inn where they were staying, he stopped and looked at her and she looked at him, and everything that had been moving toward this particular moment since he had walked into a saloon and sat down across from a woman with cold coffee and survey notes arrived at its destination. He kissed her gently, a careful, questioning first kiss, and she answered it with a certainty that surprised even herself, her free hand moving to the front of his shirt and holding on. When they stepped back from each other, the night was very quiet and warm around them, and Ada was aware of a feeling she had not felt in a long time and had perhaps never felt in quite this way, settled, as though something that had been moving at speed had finally found its right ground and could slow down. "We still have to get back to Redrock Crossing," she said. "Yes, we do," he agreed. "And there is still a significant chance that Calloway is going to make this very unpleasant." "Yes, there is." "And you are still all right with that?" He looked at her in the lamplight with his quiet gray eyes. "I have been all right with it since the first morning I sat at your table," he said. "I told 3 men in the street as much. I meant it then and I mean it now." She took his hand and held it. "Then let us go and finish this." The ride back to Redrock Crossing took 4 days, and on the morning of the 3rd day they rode into an ambush. It was not a dramatic ambush. Calloway was too cautious for drama. It was simply that Hobart and 2 other men were waiting at a narrow point in the trail where the arroyo walls rose steeply on either side, and when Clyde and Ada rode into the gap, the 3 men were positioned above them on both sides. Hobart called down from the right, "That is far enough." "Miss Merriweather, any documents related to the Redrock survey are the property of the Calloway Land Company by contractual right. You will hand over your document case." Clyde's hand had moved to the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard without any particular drama, the practiced reach of a man who had grown up in rough country and knew what a rifle was for. Ada sat very still on her bay mare. "No," she said. "That is not a conversation I am interested in having," Hobart said. "Then you are welcome to leave," Ada said. There was a long pause. Clyde was reading the terrain, and the position of the men above them with the quiet, precise attention of someone taking in a great deal of information very quickly. The arroyo walls were steep but not unclimbable. Hobart and one man were to the right, one man to the left. 3 guns to 2 was not good odds, but 3 men who preferred intimidation to violence were a different calculation than 3 men who had been given an order to shoot. Judge Price has issued a preliminary order restoring the Vasquez claim, Clyde said conversationally. A territorial marshal has a copy of that order, so does the district land office in Santa Fe. What Miss Merriweather is carrying is therefore not evidence that can be suppressed. It has already been heard. Taking it now would accomplish nothing except give the marshal grounds to come after you personally. This was a calculated bet. Not all of it was entirely true at this precise moment, but it was true enough, and more importantly, it was the kind of thing that a man like Hobart, who was paid to intimidate and not to die for a lost cause, would think carefully about. There was a silence. Hobart looked at Clyde. Clyde looked back at him with the gray-eyed equanimity of a man who has made his assessment and is comfortable with it. "Move on," Hobart said finally, and the 3 men pulled back from the arroyo rim. Clyde and Ada rode through the gap and out the other side, maintaining an even pace until the arroyo was well behind them. Then Ada let out a long breath. "The marshal does not actually have the order yet," she said. "No," Clyde agreed, "but he will by the time it matters." She looked at him. "That was well done. I have had some experience with difficult negotiations." "Where?" "Mostly with horses," he said, "but the principle is similar. You read what the other person is most afraid of and give them a reason to believe that fear is already realized." She almost laughed. "You negotiated a standoff by reasoning from horse trading. Everything important I know about people I learned from horses." She did laugh then, freely and fully, and the tension of the past hour dissolved in it, and they rode on through the late afternoon light toward Redrock Crossing with their horses moving easily beneath them, and the immense sky turning rose and gold above the high desert. They rode into Redrock Crossing 2 days later to find that the town had been stirred up in their absence. The territorial marshal, whose name was Cobb, had indeed received the copy of Price's order that had been sent ahead by courier from Santa Fe, and he had arrived in Redrock Crossing the day before, which had caused Bert Calloway and his hired men to abruptly become much more cautious in their movements. Marshal Cobb was a lean, practical man who had been doing his job long enough to have a very low tolerance for people who wasted his time, and a very high respect for documentary evidence. He met with Ada and Clyde the morning after they returned and spent 2 hours going through the survey documents in the precise, unhurried way of someone who wanted to understand exactly what he was being asked to enforce. At the end of those 2 hours, he set the documents down and looked at Ada. "In 22 years of this work, Miss Merriweather, I have not encountered a cleaner piece of documentation of surveying fraud. This is thorough and it is damning." "Thank you, Marshal," Ada said. "I will be paying a visit to Sila's graft this afternoon. I imagine he will be cooperative." His tone suggested that he intended to be quite clear about the consequences of non-cooperation. "And I will serve the restoration order on Calloway tomorrow morning, in the presence of enough witnesses that the process is clearly documented." He paused, looking at her steadily. "You understand that Calloway is a man with resources and he will contest this in court." "I understand that," Ada said. "I also understand that the evidence is comprehensive enough to withstand any challenge he brings. I have done my work correctly." "I believe you have," the marshal said simply. Bert Calloway received the restoration order the next morning. He received it badly, in the way of a man who was accustomed to having things his way, and found the abrupt removal of that customary privilege deeply insulting. He made several statements, in the hearing of sufficient witnesses, to the effect that the order was fraudulent, and that he would have it overturned. Marshal Cobb listened to these statements with a neutral expression, and then reminded Calloway, in very clear language, that obstructing a territorial court order was a federal offense. Calloway's 3 hired men quietly left Redrock Crossing the following day. Hobart, Clyde noted, left in somewhat more of a hurry than the others, which suggested the man had done the math on the Arroyo encounter and decided the area had become professionally inconvenient for him. The Vasquez family returned to their land on a morning that was warm and brilliant with spring light, and Ada and Clyde rode out with them. They watched Miguel Vasquez walk to the boundary of his claim and stand on it in the specific, precise way of a man who is planting his feet on something that is his and needs to feel that it is real. His wife, Rosa, put her hands over her face for a moment in the way of someone who cannot quite contain an emotion that is too large for the available space, and then she composed herself and began directing the children in the unloading of the wagon with brisk, efficient energy. Miguel turned from the boundary and looked at Ada. "You did this," he said. "We did this," Ada said, and she looked at Clyde. Miguel looked between them for a moment. Then he smiled, a full and genuine smile that changed his face entirely. "You two should also make a home," he said. "There is good land here." 2 weeks later, after Ada had completed the survey documentation for the Tanner parcel and submitted it to Judge Price, and after Marshal Cobb had confirmed that Silas Graft had agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation into his conduct at the land office, and after the Tanner family had received their own restoration order and returned to their claim with a satisfaction that was quieter than the Vasquez's, but no less profound, Clyde Ellsworth sat down across from Ada Merriweather at their usual table in the saloon of Redrock Crossing, ordered 2 cups of coffee that were this time hot, and said, "I would like to file a provisional land claim." Ada set down her pen. "Which parcel?" "The southwest quarter of Section 14, he said. "The one with the good grassland and the spring-fed creek." She was quiet for a moment. She knew that parcel. She had surveyed it herself, 2 days after arriving in Redrock Crossing. In the methodical way, she surveyed all the land she was going to be working around. It was one of the finest pieces of land in the basin. Deep grass, reliable water, a natural windbreak of rock formations along the north side, and a bench above the creek where you could build a house that would look out over the basin with that enormous sky above it. She had thought about it more than once, the view from that bench, and what it would look like at sunrise. "That is very good land," she said. "I think so too," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I also think it is big enough for 2 people to build something on, if both of those people agreed that it was what they wanted." She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the saloon window and across the table and across his face, and she looked at him with the clear and honest eyes of a woman who had learned to see accurately and was seeing accurately now. She saw a man who was steady and honest and capable, and who looked at her with a directness and warmth that she had stopped believing she would find. "I have never built anything," she said. "I have always been moving." "I know." "I have been too." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I think we both moved towards something. I think we might have arrived." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside on the street, the town was going about its business with the ordinary sounds of the morning, horses and wagon wheels and voices. The bartender was pretending very hard to be absorbed in his glass polishing at the far end of the counter. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word, but she said it with a completeness and a certainty that made it as large as any she had ever spoken. They were married in Redrock Crossing 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early summer, in the small whitewashed church at the end of the main street. The minister, a gentle, long-bearded man named Reverend Moore, performed the ceremony with a warmth and simplicity that was exactly right. Miguel and Rosa Vasquez were there, and their children, and the Tanner family, and Emmeline Cross the schoolteacher, and Allen Hatch had made the journey up from Mesilla specifically, arriving the day before on the stage with his best hat on and an expression of profound personal satisfaction. Ada wore a dress that Rosa Vasquez had helped her make, cream-colored with a small lace collar, and she wore her hair down for the first time in Clyde's memory, auburn and thick, and loosely braided over one shoulder. She walked to the altar without any fanfare or hesitation, and when she stood beside Clyde and looked at him, her eyes were bright and completely clear. He said his vows in the plain, direct voice of a man who chose his words carefully because he meant all of them. She said hers with a quiet steadiness that was entirely her own, and when she got to the part about remaining beside him, her voice did something that she had not expected. It deepened and softened at once, carrying the weight of all the years of moving and the accumulated weariness of building things alone, and the relief and joy of having arrived somewhere with someone. Old Olin Hatch, in the front row, wiped his eyes without any apparent embarrassment. They filed the land claim the following Monday and began building. The house took the better part of the summer to raise, with the help of Miguel Vasquez and a good carpenter from town named Breckenridge, who had a way with timber framing that made the structure strong and clean-lined and built to last. Clyde worked alongside the men every day, and Ada surveyed the placement of every structure with exact precision, ensuring the house sat on the bench above the creek at the perfect angle to catch the morning light and the evening breeze. She also, to the great amusement of Clyde and the deep respect of Breckenridge, made several adjustments to the framing plans that resulted in a sturdier wall structure than the original design had called for, because she had spent enough time in the territory to know what the winter winds required. By October, they were sleeping in their own house, in the room that looked east over the basin, waking to sunrises that were everything Ada had imagined when she first stood on that bench and looked at the view. In the spring of the following year, 1879, their son was born. They named him James, after Clyde's father, and he was born in the new house on an early April morning with Rosa Vasquez attending, and the spring wind coming down off the high country clean and cold through the open window. Clyde sat outside the bedroom door through the long hours of labor in the patiently terrified way of new fathers, and when Rosa opened the door and told him he could come in, he walked into the room and saw Ada, tired and brilliant-eyed, holding a small red-faced boy who was already loudly and emphatically declaring his opinion of the world. Ada looked up at Clyde. She was exhausted and radiant and completely herself, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put his arm around her carefully and looked at his son, and something in his chest expanded to a size that had no name in the available vocabulary. "James," Ada said, looking at the baby. "He has your eyes." "He has your voice," Clyde said, which made her laugh, and the baby, startled by the laugh, looked up with unfocused dark gray eyes in a way that suggested he was going to have opinions about a great many things. He did have Clyde's eyes, as it turned out, and Ada's opinions, and both of his parents' stubbornness in full measure, which the entire household would discover in due course. The Redrock Basin settled into itself over the following years in the way that places do when the people in them are finally allowed to be what they are. The Vasquez family's homestead produced, put food by, and began to grow. The Tanners built a second structure and brought out cousins from Texas to help work the land. The town of Redrock Crossing expanded a little, acquired a proper doctor and a bigger schoolhouse, and the particular atmosphere of suppressed anxiety that had hung over it while Calloway's influence was dominant slowly and completely dissolved. Bert Calloway's legal challenges to Judge Price's ruling proceeded through the territorial courts for the better part of 2 years, and they lost, each in turn, because the evidence Ada had compiled was as she had promised, comprehensive and unassailable. Calloway retained the land he had legitimately purchased. He was stripped of everything he had acquired through fraud. He did not leave the territory, but he became in the years that followed a considerably smaller, quieter figure, a man who had been shown the limits of what he could take without consequences, and who had adjusted his sense of himself accordingly. Silas Graft was removed from his position at the land office and received a formal censure from the territorial administration. He also left Redrock Crossing, and the general feeling of the town at his departure was one of uncomplicated relief. The land office got a new deputy commissioner, a young woman from Santa Fe named Celia Reyes who had read law and was deeply unimpressed by men who tried to explain things to her that she already knew better than they did. Ada liked her immediately and profoundly. Ada herself continued her survey work, riding out most mornings into the basin and the surrounding country with her equipment and her ledger, taking measurements and making maps that were precise and permanent, and would serve the landowners of the Redrock Basin for decades after she made them. She was widely respected, and more importantly to her, widely trusted, which was something that mattered differently than respect, more specific and more earned. She built a reputation in the territory that had nothing to do with anyone's permission and everything to do with the quality of her work. She and Clyde built the ranch through the late 1870s and into the 1880s with the particular satisfaction of people who are building something together that both of them care about deeply. He had the eye for horses he had always had, and the Ellsworth horses became known through the territory for their quality and their training, because Clyde had the patience to do the work properly, and Ada had the practicality to ensure that the business side of the operation made as much sense as the animal side. They argued sometimes, in the way of two people who both have strong opinions and neither of whom has any practice at being wrong. But the arguments were clean and honest, and always found their way to resolution, because both of them had learned too much about what mattered to waste much time defending positions they had already recognized as indefensible. In the autumn of 1881, their daughter came. They named her Clara, after Ada's mother, and she arrived in the world with a degree of personal energy and specificity that suggested she was going to be someone who did exactly what she wanted with her life and was going to be entirely comfortable with that. James, who was 2.5 and therefore deeply certain that the center of the universe was a specific location he had already claimed, spent approximately 3 days regarding his new sister with intense suspicion, and then on the 4th day was observed sitting beside her with a protective proprietary air that he maintained thereafter. That winter, Clyde built a second bedroom onto the house, extending the east-facing wall out into the view of the basin so that Clara's room, when she was old enough to use it, would also wake to the sunrise. He built the frame strong, the way Breckenridge had taught him, with the winter wind in mind, and Ada helped him raise the main beam because she was stronger than most people expected and had never seen any reason not to be. One evening in January, with the fire built high and the children asleep, and the basin outside showing 3 inches of clean snow under a hard, bright moon, Ada sat at the table in the main room with her survey maps and her tea, and Clyde sat across from her reading a letter from a horse buyer in Albuquerque, and the silence between them was the deep, settled, full silence of people who are exactly where they should be. After a while she looked up from her maps and looked at him across the table, and he looked up at the same moment, and they looked at each other in the firelight with the straightforward, unperforming quality of two people who have nothing left to prove to each other. "Do you ever miss moving?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely in the way he thought about everything. "I missed having somewhere to move toward," he said. "I do not miss not having somewhere to be." She looked at him. "I spent 7 years moving. I was very sure that was what I was built for. What do you think now?" She looked around the room. At the fire, at the maps spread across the table, at the small pair of boots James had left by the door, at the sleeping forms of their children in the rooms beyond, at the man across the table from her, who had walked into a saloon and sat down across from a woman with cold coffee and survey notes, and refused to be warned off by anyone. "I think I was built to move until I found the right place," she said, "and then built to stay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the same." She reached across the table, and he took her hand, the same way he had taken it in a Santa Fe restaurant, what felt like both a long time ago and no time at all. And they sat together in their warm house above the spring-fed creek, with the snow coming down softly in the moonlit basin outside, and everything was resolved and everything was whole, and everything was exactly as it should be. Old Olin Hatch came to visit in the spring of 1882, making the journey up from Mesilla with the determination of a man who intends to see the things he wants to see while he still can. And he sat on the porch of the Ellsworth house in the warm April afternoon light and looked out over the basin with the expression of someone who has witnessed a satisfying number of things done correctly in his long life. James brought him a cup of coffee with careful 5-year-old solemnity, and Olin drank it and pronounced it good and then looked at Ada with bright, knowing eyes. "You are happy," he said, as though confirming a calculation. "I am," she said. "Good, you deserve to be." He looked at Clyde. "So do you, son." "I know," Clyde said. Olin sipped his coffee. Below the porch, the Ellsworth horses moved in the paddock in the gentle late afternoon light, dark and bay and palomino, their heads up in the warm breeze. The basin spread out south and west, red rock and green grassland and the distant blue of mountains, the sky above it the particular deep blue of the New Mexico Territory spring that still, after years of looking at it, made Ada catch her breath. Miguel Vasquez rode over that afternoon with his eldest son, Diego, to return a borrowed tool, and stayed for supper, and they sat around the table in the warm evening, adults and children together, eating and talking and laughing in the specific, unforced way of people who have been through difficult things together and have come out the other side intact. After supper, when Olin had been settled in the guest room with his bag and his tea, and the Vasquez family had ridden home through the blue dusk, and the children had been put to bed with James making his nightly extended negotiations about whether the number of stories required for sleep was truly settled at 2, and Clara making the quiet, absolute sleeping face of someone who has decided the question was not worth engaging with, Ada and Clyde walked out onto the porch in the darkness. The sky above the basin was enormous and brilliant with stars, the Milky Way a broad swath of cold light overhead. The spring air smelled of juniper and new grass and the faint sweetness of the creek below the bench. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses moved and blew softly, and there was no other sound except the quiet breathing of the land around them. Ada leaned against the porch rail and tipped her head back to look at the stars. Clyde stood beside her, his shoulder touching hers, looking at the same sky. "I have been thinking," she said, "about whether to take a survey commission in the northern basin next month. There are 3 families there trying to establish claims and they have no access to a surveyor. Do you want to do it?" he asked. "I do. It would take me away for about a week. Maybe 10 days. James and Clara will miss you," he said. "So will I." He paused. "But those families need someone who will do the work right, and you are the best person in this territory to do it." She looked at him in the dark. "You really mean that?" "I really mean it." He turned to look at her, and even in the starlight she could see the gray of his eyes, steady and clear and direct. "I fell in love with who you are, Ada. That does not stop being who you are because we built a house together." She was quiet for a moment. The stars turned overhead in their ancient, unhurried arcs. The horses were still in the paddock below. She turned to him and put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it in the simple, trusting way of a man who has learned to be comfortable with being loved. "3 different men warned you about me," she said quietly. "I remember. They said I was trouble from the first mile. They did, and you sat down at my table anyway. I told you then and I tell you now," he said, and his voice was warm and certain in the dark. "I have ridden trouble before." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his face. "And I would do it again, every single mile of it." She kissed him there on the porch in the starlight above the Redrock Basin, in the spring of 1882, with their children sleeping inside and the horses in the paddock and the enormous New Mexico sky above them. And the kiss was warm and unhurried and completely certain, the kind that belongs to people who have arrived. Later, inside, she sat at the table one more time, not with survey maps but with a small personal journal she kept, and wrote in it with the same precise hand she used for everything. She wrote about the basin and the stars and the children. She wrote about the work in the North Basin she was planning and the 3 families who needed it done. She wrote about the way the spring light fell across the grassland in the afternoon. And then she wrote, because it was true and she wanted to set it down in a place where it would last. He was told I was trouble from the first mile. He said that was fine. He has ridden trouble before. It turned out, she wrote, that what 3 men had meant as a warning was simply a description of the road that brought us both somewhere worth arriving at. The spring of 1882 moved into summer, and the Ellsworth horses were sold to buyers from 3 different territories, and replaced with young stock that Clyde selected with his usual precise eye and began training with his usual patient deliberateness. Ada completed the Northern Basin survey and came home on the 10th day to James running toward her horse the moment she appeared on the road above the ranch, and Clara standing on the porch with the particular dignified composure of a toddler who has decided that showing too much emotion is beneath her, though the expression broke entirely when Ada swung down from the bay mare and gathered both of them into her arms. The families in the North Basin had their surveys. Their claims would hold. Clyde was at the paddock gate when she rode in, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his version of "very glad to see you," the slight easing around his eyes and the quiet directness of his regard. "How was the North Country?" he asked. "Beautiful," she said, "and the claims are solid. The Morales family and the 2 others will be fine." "Good." He took the bay mare's bridle while she dismounted. "Olin sent a letter. He is coming for the summer." "Good," she said. "And Miguel is planning to put in a 3rd field next season. He wants your survey of the South Quarter. He will have it." Clyde tied the mare and turned to look at her, and she looked back at him in the warm summer afternoon with the basin spread out below them in all its enormous, Redrock grassland beauty, and between them was every mile they had traveled and every door they had pushed through and everything they had built, and it was solid and it was real and it was theirs. "Welcome home," he said. She crossed the space between them and leaned against his chest, and he put his arms around her in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of a man who knows how to hold what matters to him. "It is good to be home," she said. And the basin was quiet in the summer light, and the horses moved in the paddock, and above them the sky stretched its enormous, unconstrained blue over everything, and the Ellsworth house sat on its bench above the spring-fed creek exactly as she had placed it, looking out over all of it in the morning and the evening, year after year, standing solid against the winter wind with its strong frames and its warm hearth. Full of maps and children and coffee and survey notes, and the particular kind of love that does not flinch from difficult roads, because it knows that the right destination is worth every mile of trouble it took to reach it.